Scottish. Okay, great. He's fine. He's Scotch.
He's Scotch. Like the tape.
Yeah. What is he, Dominican? But it's just like this hoity-toity attitude where they're just like, what deal? What deal was worked?
We got Jay with $20. Sam, have you ever been with a sister? You seem like you'd have legit game with black girls.
I do. Black people love me. Black people are obsessed with me.
Me too.
And they say, well, they are.
I know.
They're obsessed with you, and they're obsessed with me.
I don't know what it is.
They say like they call me like the one. Black people will say like he's the one, and they'll say you stupid, which means you're funny.
Yeah.
He's so stupid, but they'll say like he's the one. Black women will like catch them staring at me, and then when I catch them staring at me, they'll get mad. I'll be like, what are you staring at? They're like, I was staring at you. You ain't. You look good though. White saviors, white people, white liberals, they think that I'm some kind of racist. Black people know that I'm a voice of the community. I came home and my Pop-Tart earmuff was gone. My mama was there. Where your Pop-Tart? Where your ear, boy?
That's in my belly.
You're not listening to me. You're not listening to me because you ain't got no air, boy. Black people know. They say, yo, dude, trust me, I get emails from these people. I get emails from people, they're like, these white liberals, they're like, are you serious? You said X, Y, and Z. You can't believe that. How you can't actually think that? And then I get emails. I'm like, yo, brother, I'm in jail for 45 years, and you were mad. And hey, if you ever end up in jail, I got your back. I'm serious. I'm being serious. I'm right now. Oh, shit. Yeah. Get the fuck out of here. You gotta stay. Because black people legit worship me. I can't go on the street without being mobbed by these people. They're like, hey, is that Sam? Hey, bro, not today. No, not today. I gotta go. I gotta go help the charity out. That's my life. I'm gonna whoop that ass. I'm gonna crawl up in that ass like a crawdad. I'm gonna crawl up in that ass like a crackleberry crawdad.
Have you seen the black cornstarch? Yes.
To me, that is more normal than getting a bird as a pet. Simon Mole is the guy. He got taken into Sweden and he gave hundreds of women HIV, a poem about infecting.
You wrote a poem about it?
Yes. Came from Africa, trying to guilt women into not using a condom while knowing that he had AIDS. Going back to this, this is not the same thing as ripping race smokers their race. Because that's funny. If they had with black people, I love black people. Death Comedy Jam is my favorite. That's the best comedy. Is Death Comedy Jam. And when they rip on white people, that's a different thing. That's not this like different culture, like feeling sorry for yourself, painting yourself. I've been a slave for 400 years. That shit's different from what I'm talking about. Like, I might not see that ever again. When I fell in someone's driveway, and as soon as I fell, I hear some fucking ghetto person go, "Get the fuck out of here with that shit." We're starting by showcasing black voices. We're starting by showcasing the voices that need to be heard in our community. We're relaxing on the beach in Jamaica right now. We're not in fall with my man. We're in Jamaica. He's making his own choice, but I'd be concerned about hearing. He's an adult. He can do what he wants. If he wants to damage his hearing, risk damaging his hearing, then that's fine. But if he's going to subject a young child to that, I don't think that's responsible. So that's the main thing I'm worried about with that video is the potential for hearing damage.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Hayes, and today, by request of YouTube commenter Dark Flame Master Death, we're counting down the top 10 oldest MMORPGs. The MMORPG genre is older than most people realise, so today we're going to take a trip back through time and discover where the genre came from. I've been working on a documentary called Our Virtual World, a history of the MMORPG, chronicling the very beginnings. You can go watch each episode on my channel for free as it comes out, but today let's take a look at the oldest of the old. Before we go full on blast from the past, if you could do me a massive favour and like the vid, sub to the channel and ring the bell, your support is the only thing that makes these videos possible. Some of these games are still online today, but most came and went, advancing the genre in some way or other, but ultimately arriving years before their time. These were the pioneers of the online game and laid the way for generations to come. With all that sorted, let's journey into the past and discover the top 10 oldest MMORPGs. At number 10, Ultima Online, 1997. The Ultima series of games were absolutely groundbreaking in many ways, with many people considering Ultima 1 to be the very first open-world game. The Ultima series was created by English game designer Richard Garriott and spanned an impressive 9 games, but the one we're most interested in is Ultima. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Hayes, and today, by request of YouTube commenter Dark Flame Master Death, we're counting down the top 10 oldest MMORPGs. The MMORPG genre is older than most people. RPGs. At number 10, Ultima Online, 1997. The Ultima series of games were absolutely groundbreaking in many ways, with many people considering Ultima 1 to be the very first open-world game. The Ultima series was created by English game designer Richard Garriott and spanned an impressive 9 games, but the one we're most interested in is Ultima Online. The online world hadn't yet been conquered, and Richard brought his dry British wit and humour to it as he assumed the role of Lord British, his in-game persona, and invited us all to explore the isometric world of Ultima Online. It was brutal and unforgiving, almost fully PvP. Rules and laws were made mostly by players, and griefing was rife, but those that did play still remember it as a great old time. And if you're sad you missed out on that brutal gameplay, then don't be. It's still online and you can go and play for free right now. It should also be noted that Richard Garriott is considered the grandfather of the MMORPG genre because he's the guy who actually came up with the acronym MMORPG. So every time you say it, think of Lord British. Number 9. Tibia, 1997. If you like your camera top down and your graphics made of square tiles, then you'll love Tibia. As is the trend with older games, this game is very, very hard, and survival in Tibia was a constant struggle, with roving enemies able to rip you to shreds and other players having no real reason to help you. Life in Tibia wasn't pleasant, but for those strong few who survived it, it was one of the first MMORPGs to really focus on combat. It was also the first MMORPG to prominently feature an equipped items screen to the right-hand side of the display, showing your feature folk strong few who survive no real struggle, with roving enemies able to rip you to shreds and other players having no real reason to help you. Life in Tibia wasn't pleasant, but for those strong few who survived it, it was one of the first MMORPGs to really focus on combat. It was also the first MMORPG to prominently feature an equipped items screen to the right-hand side of the display, showing your equipment at a glance. If you fancy a go at surviving in Tibia, it's still playable online, which means it actually holds the honour of being one of the oldest, original, still playable MMORPGs in the world. Number 8. The Realm Online, 1996. Look, you have to understand that this period in time no one actually understood what this genre was, so they were just throwing ideas out there and seeing what stuck. The Realm Online was one of the earliest attempts at making pixel art as graphically pleasing as possible, and believe me, while these graphics may look like trash today, back in 1996 they were absolutely top of the range for an online game. The Realm Online was a 2.5D fantasy game where you walked along static backgrounds to interact with things, be those people or NPCs. It was also the very first game to create and use separate instances of smaller areas for unique players, meaning not all of its world was public. If you're a fan of private instances in MMORPGs, you can thank the Realm Online. Number 7. Meridian 59, 1996. Ask most people what the oldest MMORPG is and they'll say Meridian 59, and in a way they'd be right, but in a much more accurate way they'd be wrong. Meridian 59 was the first fully realised 3D MMORPG, allowing you to explore the world in first person and travel around generic fantasy locations, from castles to quaint villages to maze-like forests. When I say maze-like forests, I mean it. The trees were simply flat surfaces with a green leaf texture, and it was designed exactly like the old Windows Maze screensaver. Meridian 59 was, at the time, a giant leap forward in video game creation, but it arrived so far ahead of its time, sales were dismal, player retention was low, and the gameplay itself was clunky. Not a bad effort for 1996, but not the boost the genre needed. It was closed down, reopened, then closed again. A few private servers sprang up due to a developer leaking the source code, and now it's actually available on Steam. So if you're feeling nostalgic or want to go sightseeing in the oldest 3D MMORPG in the world, go and download it. Number 6. Baram, known in the West as Nexus Kingdom of the Winds, 1996. Say Nexon to the average person and they'll look at you confused, but say it to an MMORPG history nerd and they'll say, oh, the company who produced such magnificent titles as Final Fantasy XIV, MapleStory and ArcAge, well, Nexon began way back with this little gem. Released in Korea in 1996 under the name Baram, this top-down tile and sprite game was based heavily on Eastern mythology and was the very first online game to cast you as the role of the super special chosen hero, despite there being thousands of players. So if, like me, you dislike the chosen one trope, you can blame Nexus Kingdom of the Winds. It wouldn't see a Western release for several years, and when it did release in the West, the industry had moved on so much it flew under the radar, but it absolutely dominated Korea for quite some time. In fact, this game is likely the catalyst for the Korean MMORPG craze, so all those Korean grindfests started here. We're halfway through. Remember, if you want a more detailed look at the complete history of the genre, go watch our virtual world, A History of the MMORPG. It's much more comprehensive. At number 5, Legends of Kesmai, 1996. Legends of... At number 5, World, A History of the MMORPG. It's much more comprehensive. At number 5, Legends of Kesmai, 1996. Legends of Kesmai was actually a remaster of an even older game, but it changed enough to be considered a new release, updating the graphics to glorious 16-bit sprites. The game was revolutionary for its time. If you wanted to play it, you had to be with internet provider AOL, but if you weren't, you could join a monthly subscription service called GameStorm and still play, which makes Legends of Kesmai the very first monthly subscription-based MMORPG. Critics at the time said this was an awful idea and no one would pay, but as we know, history has proved them wrong. Number 4, Legends of Future Past, 1992. We're getting into the really old games now, so old in fact this game doesn't even have graphics. It's a text-based multi-user dungeon, or MUD. Now, playing online games back in the day was a complex thing because the open internet as we know it today didn't exist, and games were exclusive to specific internet providers. Imagine if you could only play World of Warcraft if you had Comcast internet, or only play Guild Wars 2 with Virgin internet. It was basically like that. So you'd choose your internet provider based on what games they had available. Legends of Future Past was the very first game to get around this limitation and be available to everyone with a modem, meaning if you could access the internet at all, you could play this game. It was a simple text fantasy adventure, and while it may not look like much, it was the very first MMORPG to include a crafting system. So if you like gathering and then creating stuff from the things you've gathered, you can thank Legends of Future Past. At number 3, Neverwinter Nights, 1991. No, not that Neverwinter Nights, the original Neverwinter Nights. Nope, not that Neverwinter Nights either, the older Neverwinter. Look, gaming companies, this is what happens when you use the same name for a game twice. Looking at you, Medal of Honor, Tomb Raider, and, well, Neverwinter Nights, obviously. The award-winning 2002 Dungeons RPG Neverwinter Nights isn't the original, although it is an amazing game. For the original, we've got to go back to 1991. Described as a graphical adventure game and with a limit of 50 players per server, the game switched between exploration mode, meaning you had a static picture of where you were with some text description, and full-on adrenaline-packed combat mode, which meant you have a tiled view of your sprite and some enemies, and you fight in a turn-based system. Despite not having an in-game guild system, players made guilds and connected through forums. Forums. Remember those? At number 2, Habitat, 1986. In 1986, no one had any idea that video games would become the most popular form of entertainment ever, never mind online games. But one company was brave, or stupid enough, to try and make a large-scale commercial virtual hangout. LucasArts. Yes, the same guys behind such legendary films as The Phantom Menace and Howard the Duck made one of the first MMORPGs. Habitat was a 2D side-scrolling virtual space where players could exist, explore and interact. You could do such exciting things as change your head and talk to other players, but only in short bursts as the text display box wasn't very big, and that's pretty much it. No overarching plot, no big world-ending threat or boss to kill, just a place to be, really. I mean, it was impressive for the time. Also, the original TV trailer for this game is still online. Go and watch it, it's insane. And number 1, the world's oldest MMORPG, the very inception of the genre, Island of Kesmai, 1985. Back in 1980, classmates John Taylor and Kelton Flynn made the offline single-player fantasy game Dungeons of Kesmai, based heavily on Dungeons & Dragons. It used simple ASCII graphics. Then, 5 years later, in 1985, they updated it to Island of Kesmai, hosted it through the CompuServe internet provider, and let multiple players all adventure together. But there are a few things to note. Technically, it was a multi-user dungeon with ASCII graphics, players, enemies, walls, items, all represented by letters or numbers. It was the very first online game to feature item drops, mobs, skills, classes, and leveling up. It's pretty much the birth of the MMORPG genre. But as internet at the time was limited to a 56k download speed, the game would only process one command every 10 seconds. So next time you think a few milliseconds of lag is unplayable, consider waiting 10 seconds for every attack. Thanks for watching. If you played any of these, then let me know in the comments below, and if you want to know even more about the history of the genre up until the modern day, then go and watch our virtual world, A History of the MMORPG. A massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Twitch who make all my content possible, and if you'd like to join the Patreon, Twitch stream, Discord server or Twitter, check the links in the description below. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Hayes, and I'd like to share with you the amazing story of the MMORPG. I've spent tens of thousands of hours inside virtual worlds, journeying through fantastic lands, going on unforgettable adventures, and making lifelong friends along the way. But how did this all start? Every corner of the globe is connected through online games, with virtual worlds larger than real-life countries accessed daily by millions of people. How were online games developed? Who built them? And what dark secrets does the industry want us to forget? Which games succeeded? Which failed? And which were the most important? I'm going to take you on a journey from 1958 to now and chronicle the rise of a genre. This is the story of our virtual world, a history of the MMORPG. What is an MMORPG? MMORPG stands for Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game. Some of these games have been so successful they've secured a place in our cultural history. They've spawned real-life merchandise, conventions, even major Hollywood films. If you've played an MMORPG, there are many mechanics and stylistic choices you'll consider standard. A medieval fantasy setting, items and equipment, your in-game avatar physically wearing the items you've equipped to them, health bars, magic energy, quests, raids and bosses, chat at the bottom of the screen, unique instances, and player-to-player trade or combat. But where did all these things come from? Who did it first? MMORPG games are created and played all over the world and have taken inspiration from every culture and time period. Yet all these different games share a few common traits. Multiple players are able to connect simultaneously to a shared, consistent world. A player will have an in-game representation, usually an avatar or character model. This is their way of interacting with both the virtual world of the game and all its inhabitants, other human players, or characters in-game not controlled by humans, such as enemies or shopkeepers, referred to as non-playable characters, or NPCs. The first M in the acronym MMORPG is massively, so it's not just 2 or 3 players connected at any one moment, it's thousands. The virtual online worlds of these games are able to hold millions of players simultaneously. However, placing millions of players into shared virtual space, with each player able to interact and affect the world, would be chaos. So players are often split over several identical versions of the game world. These different instances of the game are known as shards, worlds, or realms. Each individual instance of a world is held on a server, and when you play an MMORPG, you are connecting your computer to the game's server. The key presses of your keyboard and clicks of your mouse are sent to the server, and your in-game avatar performs the requested action. This is true for every player, meaning the servers for these games handle millions of instructions every second. Players are able to interact in real time with both the virtual world and other players. One of the most attractive aspects of the MMORPG is the social shared experience of the game. You are able to exist and interact within the world, and other players are able to observe you doing this. If I choose to walk around a virtual town, other people can choose to join in with me. The game may contain various levels of complexity, from a simple graphical user interface that allows you to type a message and have that message be seen, to a vast open destructible world that will be experienced and shared. The ability to observe and be observed by other players, then play the game in an interactive way, is a core concept of the MMORPG. The technological infrastructure needed to achieve this is incredibly impressive. But how did it start? What were the first small steps taken into this vast online world? I'm going to examine every game that had an impact on the genre, the cultural significance behind each one, the real-world events they affected, and how they shaped the MMORPG landscape today. In 1958, physicist William Higginbottom created the first computer game, Tennis for Two. Two players would use a controller each, pressing a single button to serve and return a tennis ball, represented by this dot of light on an oscilloscope screen. It was crude and basic, but it was the start of something. It was the first time two people had played a virtual game together, with the input of each player having meaning to the other. This was the catalyst for the gaming industry as a whole. But the MMORPG story truly begins 16 years later, in 1974. The year is 1974. The world population had just reached 4 billion people. The BBC launched CFAX while Killer Queen played on the radio. And in NASA's Ames Research Center in California, The BBC in 74. The world population had just reached 4 billion people. The BBC launched CFAX while Killer Queen played on the radio. And in NASA's Ames Research Center in California, programmer Steve Colley was working on his video game Maze War. 1 year earlier, Steve Colley and Greg Thompson had worked together to develop a rudimentary video game called Maze. The gameplay was simple: navigate a maze. However, the techniques used in creation of the game and the future networking abilities would lay the foundations for the MMORPG genre. Maze used a simple graphical interface, a first-person view with lines drawn from the corner of the screen toward the center to represent the walls of a corridor. To the left-hand side were details about the current maze. This screenshot may seem basic to us now, but the gameplay shown here was one of the earliest uses of placing a heads-up display, or HUD, information to the left-hand side, and pioneered the first-person viewpoint. Solving a maze was fun for a bit, but quickly grew dull. The player was alone in the virtual world, and with success being only a matter of time, the desire to play waned. Then in 1974, Howard Palmer joined the developing duo and added in an aspect that would change gaming forever. Colley writes, "Maze was popular at first but quickly became boring. Then someone, Howard or Greg, had the idea to put other people in the maze. To do this would take more than one computer, which at the time were not networked together. So we connected two computers using the serial ports to transmit location back and forth. This step of connecting two computers running the same program was the first time a single consistent game world had been played in by multiple players across multiple machines. This process directly connected two computers together, and all game information was shared between the two. When playing any online game, you as a player are generally referred to as the client. Decisions made on your own computer are called client-side, and this networked game of Maze War was the first client-to-client gaming experience. When you discovered another player in the game, they were represented by a unique username. No complex graphics or images, just a text name. The first example of players having in-game names. However, the novelty of adding people soon began to wear off. To survive, the game would need some form of competition. Colley writes more. Soon the idea for shooting each other came along, and the first-person shooter was born. Maze War now allowed connected players to battle. The in-game shooting might not have had the photorealistic graphics we expect today, but it was the first time one player could shoot at and hit another. However, the game was still limited. It required the computers playing it to be directly connected by a physical cable. This would be changed several months later, when Greg Thompson went to study at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the world-famous MIT. Working with Dave Lebling, Greg was able to expand Maze War and connect the computer running it up to ARPANET, an early form of internet that was exclusive to educational facilities, such as universities and colleges. Up to 8 computers running Maze War were able to connect to a single central server, which would collect the gameplay inputs from all of them and then relay the information back to all 8. Now the client-to-client gameplay limitation was broken. Clients could now connect to a server, and the server would share all the client's information with all the other clients. With multiple players now involved in a single maze, another feature was added. A server could generate a top-down image of the maze, with accurate locations of all players at any given time. This map could be viewed by other people through the connected terminals. As computers grew in power, Maze War was updated to match. Other players in the game were now represented by an eyeball, and the top-down map view was visible at the bottom or to the right, updated to match. As computers grew in power, Maze War was updated to match. Other players in the game were now represented by an eyeball, and the top-down map view was visible at the bottom or to the right of the screen. The history of Maze War is fascinating and complex, but this is the development aspect we're most interested in. The idea of a central server connecting gamers. At the time, servers were expensive and limited to military or educational use. The idea of an individual owning a private server, allowing for tens of thousands of connections, was at the time impossible, but the technology was potentially there. Maze War had unknowingly created some fundamental rules of gaming. Players had usernames. Players would connect to a central server. Information relating to the game would be displayed on the left-hand side of the screen. A map would be displayed to show player positions. And 11 years later, the fantasy element would be added. The history of video games would continue, but focusing on our MMORPG story, we need to wait 11 years for the next major development, and it would come from 2 classmates at the University of Virginia. In 1980, classmates John Taylor and Kelton Flynn created Dungeons of Kesmai, a simple adventure game inspired by the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons. John and Kelton would found Kesmai Studios in 1982 and develop the world-building games Mega Wars and Mega Wars 3. These games were mostly text-based, with a small part of the screen dedicated to ASCII art graphics. Dungeons of Kesmai also used ASCII graphics. ASCII is the process of taking common letter, number or symbols a computer can display and arranging them to look like a picture. It takes very little processing power to do this, as you're effectively only displaying text, not an image. The game was decent for the time, but limited to only one computer. Then, 5 years later in 1985, taking inspiration from the Maze War networking, they released an enhanced version of the game and changed the title to Island of Kesmai. This version launched on CompuServe, one of the earliest providers of commercial internet access. These types of early online games were known as multi-user dungeons, or CompuServe, one of the earliest providers of commercial internet access. These types of early online games were known as multi-user dungeons, or MUDs. They followed the same client-server connection of Maze War, but allowed many more players to connect at the same time. The in-game world was mostly explored through text description, as computer graphics were taxing to run and extremely crude. Internet at the time was limited to a download speed of 56k, and with such limited bandwidth, the game was incredibly basic, processing only one command every 10 seconds. However, even with its simplistic graphics and slow gameplay, it was adding to the genre. Players had to create a character, just like pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons, choosing a class and important attributes. This is one of the earliest examples of an online game requiring you to customize and build your own unique character. Then, once connected to the game, players had the ability to type messages and have those messages be seen by other players. The chat would appear at the bottom of the screen. A simple stylistic choice at the time that, as we know now, became the industry standard. This is how things happen. One designer does something, everyone accepts it as the done thing and follows suit. You'll see this trend a lot. Below the chat, you could see your character information. All these important stats borrowed heavily from Dungeons and Dragons, and include the amount of experience your character has gained, how much stamina you had remaining to move, and how many magic points you had. The game was a top-down dungeon crawler, with the world divided into square tiles and each move command moving your in-game avatar one tile. Your avatar was simply a letter. The tiles could sometimes contain items you were able to pick up. If a tile had an item on it, you would be able to see it represented by a lowercase letter. Weak computer-controlled enemies, known as mobs, were also present, and players could work together to kill these mobs. Players could also accept and complete in-game challenges, such as collecting a certain item or killing a certain number of mobs. These challenges became known as quests. Along with character creation, in-game chat, mobs, item drops, and quests, Island of Kesmai would influence the MMORPG genre in a much more powerful way without even being aware of it. Island of Kesmai was a fantasy game based on the fantasy world of Dungeons and Dragons, which in turn is heavily influenced by Lord of the Rings. Island of Kesmai may have been designed as a fantasy game because the creators enjoyed fantasy, but it set a precedent. Online games and fantasy were from this moment linked, and that connection would only grow as the years went on. We're only 2 influential games in, and we've already established some elements that would become cornerstones of the genre. Players connect to a central server. Each player has a unique username. Heavy inspiration from the Dungeons and Dragons fantasy tabletop game, including medieval fantasy settings, character statistics, dungeons, and collectible items. Weak enemies are known as mobs. Chain of events reward in-game experience, known as quests. Graphical representation of the game displayed to the center and top left of the screen. Heads up information to the left. In-game text chat shown to the bottom. You can see by putting all these elements together, we're starting to build what we today know as an MMORPG. Our next major step happens 14 months later, in March 1986. Thank you for watching part 1 of our virtual world, a history of the MMORPG. This project has taken thousands of hours of research, writing, and editing. If you're enjoying the journey, you can show your support by leaving a like or a comment, subscribing to the channel, or clicking the bell notification icon. Our virtual world is made possible through the support of my patrons. If you'd like to become a patron, then click the Patreon link below. Thank you for your time, and as always, have a great day. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Strife Hayes, and this is the story of our virtual world. A History of the MMORPG, Part 2. While MMORPGs weren't yet established in the gaming world, the video game revolution was in full swing, with Pac-Man arriving in 1980, Donkey Kong and Frogger 1 year later, then Pitfall, Cubert, Mario, Dragon's Lair, Tetris, Gauntlet, Ghouls and Goblins, Castlevania and The Legend of Zelda. Video games were here to stay. By March of 1986, the prospect of a large-scale MMORPG Goblins and Pitfall arriving in 19 world, the video. While MMORPGs weren't yet established in the gaming world, the video game revolution was in full swing, with Pac-Man arriving in 1980, Donkey Kong and Frogger 1 year later, then Pitfall, Cubert, Mario, Dragon's Lair, Tetris, Gauntlet, Ghouls and Goblins, Castlevania and The Legend of Zelda. Video games were here to stay. By March of 1986, the prospect of a large-scale MMORPG was possible but not commercially viable. The cost to create, host, and then actually pull revenue from an experimental project of that size would take a brave, talented, and risk-taking company. Enter LucasArts. Founded by George Lucas of Star Wars fame, LucasArts had only developed 3 games so far: the sports game Ball Blazer, the first-person shooter Rescue on Fractalis, and the maze-like fantasy adventure The Eidolon. With the gaming landscape rapidly evolving, LucasArts had a goal: to develop the first large-scale, commercially successful online community. Working with developers Randy Farmer and Chip Morningstar, the project will be developed for the Quantum Link Internet Service on the Commodore 64 and known as Habitat. By now, video game graphics had moved past the text-based ASCII art and entered the 8-bit era, allowing us to see Donkey Kong, Mario and Link as graphical representations. However, while more multi-user dungeon games had been created, none of them had taken the graphical leap, and this is what Habitat would focus on. Randy would later describe Habitat as a multi-participant online virtual environment, a cyberspace. Each participant or player would use a home computer to access the host system and be an intelligent, interactive client. Habitat was set in modern times and used a side-scrolling viewpoint, with each player or NPC standing and able to face left, right, towards or away from the camera. Each avatar could be visually customized, making it one of the earliest games to allow players to change how they would appear to other players. Text would be displayed in a speech bubble at the top of the screen. Because of the graphical user interface, or GUI, the game didn't need large chunks of descriptive text, so could focus on dialogue. The gameplay itself was basic, but the variety of interactions possible made Habitat stand out. Players could trade with other players and haggle over the price of items, allowing items and in-game money to be swapped from player to player. Players could rob other players or even be killed. This almost total freedom led to players themselves creating in-game laws and ethical codes about what is and is not acceptable, then developers moderating the game while playing on invincible avatars. These early interactions are examples of more MMORPG characteristics: the ability to attack other players unprovoked, the trade and haggle system, the use of developers playing on powerful moderation accounts. The design philosophy of Morningstar and Farmer was to create a variety of possible experiences within the virtual world, set events that will absolutely happen, then to provide players enough freedom to explore and create unique situations. This game design idea would later be split into 2 distinct camps. The idea that events should be tightly scripted and crafted by the developers for the players is known as theme park design. The name references the idea that while in a theme park, you will journey from ride to ride. The journey is simply to get to the ride, and the ride is the same every time. You know what to expect, and you know where to find it. The ride is enjoyable and has been crafted entirely for you. The idea that players should be given freedom to create their own experience is known as sandbox, based on the childhood enjoyment of playing in a sandpit. You are responsible for building or creating your own fun. The tools to have fun are provided: the sand itself, a bucket, a spade, one of those sit-on diggers, but the actual fun is in the creation of situations, not enjoying what the developer has crafted for you. Habitat was groundbreaking at the time, a multi-user dungeon set in the modern day with an 8-bit graphical interface allowing player-to-player interaction from chat to trade to robbery. Habitat also features what is likely the first case of a developer accidentally giving a player an overpowered item. One in-game event features players running away from developers in a maze. The developers are all armed with insta-kill guns. However, one developer, while doing this, forgot to turn his unlimited health on, was killed by a mob of players, and the gun looted from their corpse. The insta-kill gun was then lost in the virtual world, owned by a player somewhere. Habitat was ahead of its time in many ways. Being played on the Commodore 64 reduced its audience, and needing an active internet connection reduced it even further. Video games at the time were focused on the console market, with Atari and Nintendo battling for dominance. Habitat was proof that a large-scale online world could exist. Player interaction within the world could exist, and it could have video game standard graphics. Unfortunately, with the high cost of entry and limited player base, along with the sandbox and theme park gameplay philosophies clashing, likely arrived several years too soon. With the technology capable but the execution lacking, developers knew online games could work. They just needed to find the right mix of gameplay mechanics to truly make the MMORPG. Kesmai Studios had been watching Habitat and had seen how the online gaming world was ripe and ready for some action. So several years after developing Maze War, they decided to take shooting to the masses. Kesmai had improved the lifespan of Maze War by adding shooting, and they planned to do the same thing with online games. In 1988, they released Air Warrior, a tactical dogfight simulator. The game used simple wireframe graphics similar to Maze War to show the cockpit of a fighter plane and the ground below. One big advantage Air Warrior had over Habitat was the amount of consoles able to play it. Air Warrior would see releases on Windows, Amiga, Atari ST, CD-TV and Mac. Air Warrior would play over internet provider Genie, with the Genie servers hosting the game. Clients could connect to the server and take to the skies to battle other players. Due to internet costs at the time, Air Warrior would cost over $10 per hour to play. So why is a tactical dogfight simulator on a list of MMORPGs? Well, because of the numbers. Air Warrior allowed hundreds of players to connect to the server at once, then all play together in the same virtual space. Players flying planes or driving tanks could shoot down other players or capture strategic points on the map. Hundreds of players, all playing in real time. This dwarfed Maze War's 8-player limit and showed both developers and players that video games could be an action-packed social experience, not simply a virtual space to exist in. 2 months later, in March of 1988, Habitat would shut down due to poor profits. Lucas Games would reduce the game size and running costs, then re-release it as Club Carib, but this didn't have the same cultural or market impact as Habitat. Running an online game was extremely expensive compared to crafting a regular offline video game. In a regular game development cycle, the game is created, released and sold. Then the profit is calculated based on the amount sold versus development costs. It's easy to see which games sell well and which games don't. However, in the online gaming worlds, the development cycle never stops. Players may buy the game and then play it for many years. These players are a constant drain on resources, developer time, with the player base demanding new game content constantly. This is the first example on this list of a studio closing an online game due to poor profits, and it absolutely will not be the last. 3 years later, the fantasy elements of online games would be firmly established. Most video game fans will associate the name Neverwinter Nights with the award-winning 2002 PC adventure game, and while that was a fantastic game, it's not the original. In 1991, Beyond Software would work with developer Don Daglow to bring the Dungeons & Dragons rule set to the online world and release Neverwinter Nights. With the technical success of Air Warrior and the prestige of the Dungeons & Dragons brand, developers Don Daglow and Catherine Mataga pitched the idea of a graphical online adventure game. If the project succeeded, despite the acronym not existing yet, it would go on to become the first ever massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Side note, developer Catherine Mataga would go on to create Rayman, and despite the acronym not existing yet, game online would go on to become the first ever massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Side note, developer Catherine Mataga would go on to create Rayman and Spider-Man 2. The project was funded and launched in 1991, and despite having a limit of only 50 players per server, was a commercial success. The gorgeous box art proudly displays the claim
Okay, predictions. Predictions for 2021. And let's just get right into it. The first one is US government comes down hard on Bitcoin. Like, how could they not? How could this not happen, right? You would think, I know all these, like, I see all these people thinking, oh, it's going to be like this new currency and people go away from the dollar and, and they'll have Bitcoin instead. But you think the USA is just going to sit there and let that happen? No. I think they're going to come down hard on Bitcoin. And I don't know what exactly they're going to do. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm just saying, like, this is my guess, is that they're going to do something to make it more illegal, make it more difficult, you know, just put up obstacles to make it more of a problem. Okay, and the next prediction, this is too easy, but working from home becomes a permanent thing. You know, I see this in my own work, actually, in that, like, my current employer, they were not work from home people at all. They were really all about having people in the office. But you know, it's like they've lightened up. They've lightened up, and they've, like, you know, they've accepted people who are out of town working for them. And I just see this on LinkedIn. I see more offers from, you know, people are sort of looking for people to work remotely. This is a trend, and this is going to have consequences. I think for specifically for office space. Actually, it's. I think it was Duncan Trussell who made this comment that it's like going to the office. It's just all a lie. You know, it's like we're destroying the environment for the office. You know, all these people were commuting and were burning all this oil and all this energy so everyone can be in an office sitting next to each other. And what is the point? You know, most of these companies could do the job fine, and it's like,